First of all, I think maybe it's worth explaining in brief what dependent origination is for those of you who don't know. So dependent origination is one of the Buddha's teachings on cause and effect. And specifically is the Buddhist teachings on the cause and effects that lead to rebirth. And so the way it went is the Buddha was, trying to get enlightened and had come to this understanding that there's suffering, and whatever one does, in the best case scenario, one's going to get old and die. And most probably one's going to get old and get sick and die. And along the way there's going to be all different types of sorrows and pains and despairs. And so the Buddha went along the line of reasoning, without which one thing would there not be this whole mass of suffering? This death, old age, sickness, pain, despair. And he came to this revolutionary conclusion that without birth there would be no all of this suffering. Once we're born, the rest follows naturally. And so then he didn't stop there. He asked, without which one thing would there not be this birth? And he came to this answer that, okay, without certain types of actions that we've done in the past that produce karma, there would not be this birth. Those actions are the productive force of this new life starting. Without which one thing would there not be those actions? Well, without clinging. So if we're not clinging to something, then we don't do these actions that produce new karma. But because we are clinging to something, in its most basic form, we're clinging to wanting to exist. Then we do these actions. And without which one thing would there not be this clinging? Well, if there were no craving in the mind. Without which one thing would there be no craving? If there were no feeling, if there were no pleasant and unpleasant, there'd be nothing to crave. Without which one thing would there be no feeling? If there were no contact. So if objects didn't contact the eyes and the ears, the nose, the tongue, the skin and the mind, then there would be no feeling. And without which one thing would there be no contact to these senses? Well, if there were no six sense bases, if the eyes were not sensitive to sights, and the ears were not sensitive to sound, and the nose were not sensitive to smells, if the tongue were not sensitive to taste, and the body were not sensitive to tangible objects, and if the mind were not sensitive to mental objects, then there would be no contact if there were not what we call the six sense bases. Without which one thing would there not be these six sense bases? Without materiality and mentality. Without physical matter and without the mind. Once the mind and the matter are there, it follows that some of it is sensitive. Without which one thing would there not be this materiality and mentality? If there had been no first consciousness moment of the life, then there would be no this materiality and mentality. But once there is a first consciousness moment, then the next consciousness moment follows, and different types of materiality automatically result. So as soon as there's been this first consciousness moment of the life, then all of this other materiality mentality happens. without which one thing would there not be this first consciousness moment of the life? Well, we've had this one before, without the karma, without the actions from the life before. Without which one thing would we not have done those actions? Without ignorance, we wouldn't have done those actions. So again, oftentimes this is the ignorance that we exist. Means that it could be other ignorance as well, but in its most basic form, the ignorance that we exist causes us to do these actions that produce new karma. And when the Buddha got to the ignorance link, he was like, origination, origination. I've found the cause from which this whole wheel of suffering unfolds. And by origination, he meant, here's something we can do something about. When we get to ignorance, delusion as the cause, that means we can have wisdom as the solution. And with wisdom, we can penetrate this truth of non-self. Once we've penetrated the truth of non-self, then the actions no longer make karma. This link, a bit difficult to understand, but once we've penetrated fully the truth of non-self, so we're no longer believing that anything is me or mine, then the remaining actions that we do, walking here and there, helping people, those actions no longer produce karma in the same way that actions produce karma when there is still the wrong belief in self. And then when there's no karma, then there's no next consciousness of the next life. And then there's no materiality and mentality, then there's no six sense bases, there's no sensitivity, then there's no contact. When there's no contact, there's no feeling. No feeling means no craving. No craving means no clinging. No clinging means no more karma made, which means no more birth, which means no more old age, sickness and death. Yay. So this is the classic way that dependent origination is taught as a cycle over 3 lifetimes. And it's very profound when we learn to see this dependent origination over 3 life cycles. We have 5 different methods that we learn for seeing. And 4 methods come from the Visuddhimagga, so seeing front to back and back to front and middle to end and middle to beginning. Many ways we have to see, also on the momentary level. And then 1 method we see from the Visuddhimagga, which is looking at 1 moment in this life and seeing all of the past causes and present causes for this moment. Then the next moment in this life and seeing all of the past causes and the present causes for this moment, and so on. So also, to get to the question, so classic way of understanding dependent origination is like that, over 3 lifetimes, and its purpose is to help us understand non-self more deeply and understand the main causes for the cycle of renewed existence, of staying in samsara more and more. But there also exist, so in the Vibhanga, for those of you who know the Abhidhamma well, there also exist some teachings that explain how all of these conditions, these we call 12 links of dependent origination, can exist within a single moment, within 1 single consciousness moment. So if we want to frame it that way, we need some poetic license with the definitions of the terms, and it can also only apply to the single moment of craving, because if we are doing this teaching with a moment of loving kindness, for example, or a moment of mindfulness, then there can be no craving and delusion in this same moment. We need at least another moment to accommodate the loving kindness or the mindfulness. So in the tradition that I trained, when we are seeing all of the causes in just one moment, usually we don't do this when we are practicing the dependent origination, but we do it when we're practicing a different teaching called Patana, which is a more advanced teaching on cause and effect, because it needs very, very sharp wisdom to see, and sometimes it could be more than 30 different types of cause influencing a single moment. And then the next moment, there will be a whole different bunch of causes influencing that moment, some present, some past. So usually we do that discernment at a later time. So we also see in some traditions they take the more conceptual, or I was going to say allegorical, but it's not quite that removed, but less precise. I'm trying to think of the right word. Almost metaphorical way of explaining the dependent origination. And they do it like over the course of a typical action. So it could be something like, I have the ignorance that cake is happiness. And so because of that ignorance that cake is happiness, I go in search of cake. And that search leads to the birth of a new Beth who is with cake. And that Beth plus cake is a manifestation of materiality plus mentality. And there are the 6 sense bases, most importantly my tongue. And then when I eat the cake, there is contact and feeling and craving. And then maybe wanting more cake, and that leads me to take another bite, which gives birth to a new Beth who is Beth plus cake in the tummy, and so on. No, so more sort of metaphorical or conceptual, almost allegorical understanding of dependent origination. So this kind of conceptual understanding we can't say is wrong. It's also some truth there, and it's helping to, in the way of any good metaphor, is helping us to get an idea of how the dependent origination is working. And also it can be helpful in practice because we start to see how our craving works in relation to the feeling. This link of Vedana Pacaya Tanha, feeling creates craving. Sometimes seeing this link again and again and again can be a really helpful part of the practice. But if we understand that conceptual way of understanding is all there is to dependent origination, then we really miss the point of dependent origination. We miss the deeper point. When we're still understanding on this conceptual level, then we miss the essence, which is the teaching of non-self, and also the process of rebirth, the working of the karma. Many of the essence teachings of dependent origination we don't get. So I wouldn't say those teachings of dependent origination are wrong, but they're also not complete. Can you talk about your past lives? Ooh. So it's a little bit like the question that they asked about stream entry. especially the monastic culture, is not to go around saying, you never guess what I was in my past life. I was at this. What were you? So we try to avoid this culture. And again, the reason is that these teachings of seeing the past lives, we use them really to fuel our perception of non-self. And I'll say more about that in a minute. We use them to fuel our perception of non-self. That's why we do the practice. And so the danger when we see our past lives is that we use that information just to increase our field of self. And now, rather than just having this life's 5 aggregates to identify with, we've now got all of the other lives, stories and experiences to turn into something that is me and mine, and to be proud of or insecure about or wounded by or whatever it might be. So yeah, out of respect for that, I won't go into narrating my past lives, though it's fun. And yeah, I hope to guide some of you all of you actually, to be able to do those practices and see your past lives. But actually the way that we practice is kind of more dry and technical than that. And so I'll say a little bit about it. So before we discern our past lives, first of all, we need to be at the stage where we can discern materiality and mentality in this life at the level that it is momentarily arising and perishing away. So here materiality is everything physical, and especially our body, and mentality is everything of the mind. And what we see is that everything physical is made up of these little particles that are momentarily coming into and out of existence. And everything that is mental is made up of these moments, one after the other, that are coming into and out of existence. So we're starting to get this deep perception of impermanence arising, nothing lasting for more than a moment. So that perception of impermanence really lends itself to the perception of non-self. We can see, okay, nothing's lasting for more than a moment. There's no me to be found in any of this. But one of the views, or one of the hopes that can arise in that disorientation of not being able to find a self is, okay, this that is arising and perishing right now, that might not be me, but maybe there is a creator outside of this moment, or a creator in the past, or a controller somewhere that stands outside of this present moment and is making all of this momentary stuff happen. Does that make sense? So some people might frame that as being a god, for example. Maybe there's a god that created all of this perishing materiality and mentality. And that God won't be momentarily arising and perishing. That God will be stable. That God will be permanent. Or maybe there's a me, maybe there's a consciousness, maybe there's a creator version of me that stands outside of this. So that view is very common to arise in the minds of meditators in this like mad grab for a self somewhere in all of the impermanence. And so that's where we bring in this practice of seeing the past lives. When we see the past lives, we see them with that same perception that we're seeing this present life. Go back moment by moment by moment by moment by moment until we're seeing the first few moments of mind of this life arising and perishing. And then we trace back a few moments more, and those are the last few moments of the previous life. And we can trace back further and further and further into previous lives and previous lives and previous lives. And when we do that, what we start to see is the causal links between moments. So, there was a moment a couple of lives back that was really rooted in anger. And we can see the causal link between that moment of anger and an experience of pain, for example, in this life, a moment of pain. Directly seeing this causal link. And when we can see the causal links to what is happening right now, there comes the understanding that this moment is impermanent, this moment is arising and perishing away, and the causes of this moment were also momentary. The causes of this moment were also impermanent, and the results of this moment will also be impermanent. And so there's no place for any permanent creator. There's no place for any self outside of the perishing. And in that way we use this teaching in service of deepening our understanding of non-self. It's like there's no place for any self to hide. And so it's often this practice of seeing the past lives in this way that really takes people's Vipassana practice to a whole other level. And in fact, the Buddha said, the one who has seen the dependent origination understands the Dharma. They know what the Dharma is, because automatically you will understand the non-self. And in the commentaries we also find this term, the Chula Sotapanna, which is like the baby stream enterer. I think it was yesterday we were speaking about what is the stream entry when the meditator sees Nibbana. But the meditator who sees the dependent origination, sees this cause and effect across lives, they are not yet the stream enterer, but the baby stream enterer, because their wisdom is already very, very sharp on Dharma, on how things are working. So that's the way in which we are trained to see our past lives. And when we're doing that practice, sometimes we see the stories and I was there. But our training is really, when we see those stories, to move away from those concepts and break it back down again into, oh no, you weren't that. There was materiality, and there was consciousness, and there was feeling. And bring it back to wisdom rather than to story. Is it possible to understand dependent origination to a level that there are immediate practical applications? For example, if somebody were to see that his karma is to be hit by a bus tomorrow, he would stay home, for example. You understand the question? So when we're seeing, for example, the future independent origination, we see, tomorrow it's on the cards for me to be hit by a bus. I'm not going near any buses. I love how the cliche of being hit by a bus pops up again and again and again. Like it's the dramatic way that people die. So to see dependent origination in a way that it has immediate practical applications. So with regard to the future, the answer is kind of. So the future is always changing. So on the level of being hit by a bus tomorrow, it could be that we discern the future once and we see hit by a bus tomorrow, and then we discern the future half an hour later and all of a sudden we're not getting hit by a bus anymore. And the reason is that the future is always changing. It's changing moment to moment depending on the collective actions and the collective intention of all of the beings. So say, for example, you discern the future and you see you're getting hit by a bus tomorrow, and then somewhere off in a distant corner of the universe, the bus driver has a really bad argument with his wife and thinks, screw it, I'm not going to work tomorrow, I've had enough of this. Then you don't even know, but you discern the future again, then you won't be seeing that you're going to get hit by a bus anymore. So the future is changeable. If we want to know the future so precisely, then really we need to be discerning just a few moments before, in which case it sort of loses its practical application. But some big things that they've got more force of karma behind them. They're still changeable, but less changeable. So the main one I'm thinking of is what our next life will be when we die. I already gave you the simile of the cows. So the cows leaving the cow pen, which karma wins? Is it a strong one or a most likely one? Or is it something we're doing near the death time? So that uncertainty is still there. But if we have done some weighty karma, some really strong karma, or if we have some very, very strong habit in our karma that is like 70-80% of the cows are that one, then it's likely that we will see that karma ripening. It's likely that we will see what would happen if that karma were the one to ripen at our near-death time. But it's not certain, it's just likely. And then what we see is that when people meditate more, their future lives change. And when people meditate less, also their future lives change. So future is changeable, and the level to which we can see, I think it doesn't have much practical application. Only the Buddha could predict some really definite things, like if he gave the definite prophecy or some karma that was so heavy that it wasn't going to change, like Devadatta going to the hell realm and some things like this. But for us, usually we don't have this ability. Actually, the very real practical application of dependent origination comes in discerning the past causes for our present experience. And so now we experience some suffering, for example. When we can find the past karmic causes, it completely transforms our understanding of that suffering in the way that we already discussed. So it removes the inclination to blame. It makes us see, oh, the thing that caused this suffering, that thing was also suffering. So, for example, maybe in the past some action rooted in anger means that now I suffer. But in the past, that me who was angry, it was also a form of suffering. In this way, just cycle of suffering. As compassion arises. I remember the most powerful time I can remember ever doing this it was actually the first time I'd ever been asked to do a certain type of dependent origination by Pa Auk Zero, and we had to see all of the past causes for one present moment. And because it was a meditation retreat, and everyone's being quiet, and so there's no like vivid present moment experience to really catch. It's very difficult to find the past life causes for now, for example, seeing the floorboards. This isn't really like strong enough perception for our mind to grab. Usually we need something that feels like a bit more of an event. So I was struggling, and then I had really bad menstruation pain, and I was like, all right, I will try and see if I can see. There's also present causes. No, the present cause is my body is contracting, but I see if I can also see any past causes for this pain. And when I could see this like angry intention, this really inflamed intention there, and perfect causal link to this present experience of pain. I was like, oh, okay. And that seeing has remained with me to this day whenever I have this menstruation pain. Oh, wow. Just one menstruation pain is bearable in my case. No, it's not some overwhelming form of suffering, but it reminds me, be heedful. Intention really matters. Our intention really gives results. And in this way, it has practical application. It can all the time bring us back to the Dharma again and again and again. So that's my answer to that question. We can't use the dependent origination to find the winning lottery numbers. Otherwise we would have a lot of very lucky monks and nuns. So the question is, how did seeing dependent origination... Wait, I've forgotten. How did seeing dependent origination change your relationship to your own death? So, seeing the dependent origination definitely normalizes death, because we see it happen so many times. So, it becomes, what's the word? I mean, death is predictable anyway. We all know it's going to happen, but really predictable when you've seen it happen to you many, many times. So it really normalizes death. And I was going to say it brings an acceptance, which on one level is true. It brings an acceptance, but it also brings an urgency. There's an inevitability. Like, okay, so I could get born again, but then I'm going to die again, and then I'll get born again, and then I'll die again. And it's inevitable. That cycle's just going to go on and on and on. And we can see it going back as far as we can remember. Just born, die, born, die, born, die, born, die, born, die, born, die. And so it also brings an urgency. There's acceptance around death, but there's also real burning urgency to find an escape from that very predictable, monotonous cycle. And so one of the things that dependent origination does, I remember the first time I had to do the practice to see into the future. And you've already looked at the past. Born, die, 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 born, die. And then you have to look into the future, and there's this feeling like, please stop. Please stop. And then you see born, die, born, die, born, die. And by that time, you're understanding a little bit of the causes that are keeping this cycle going. And because of that wisdom, most of the meditators who are practicing at that level can see the end. They can see there's this many lives left before they can attain Nibbana and they can make an end. And seeing that end is very big relief. Big relief. Another way that seeing the dependent origination changed my view of death was understanding the importance of wisdom at the near-death time. And because of that, it follows understanding the importance of having trained the mind in the lifetime so that we can have the wisdom at the death time. There were times, very recent actually, comparatively recent, where the death in my past life was very painful, but because of wise attention on that pain, the next life was very blissful. As a direct result of wise attention on that pain, of not falling into, poor me, this hurts so much, how terrible, oh no, I'm going to die. But instead, okay, it's pain, it's impermanent. Looking at the changes, looking at the 4 elements. Some of you now practicing 4 elements meditation. Because of this, the next life is very blissful because of that wisdom in the death time. So I also understood that. Understood the power of, if it is possible, to enter the jhana at the death time. Very good. The next life will be very good. We call it Brahma life. And the whole life is in jhana. And it means that whatever life comes after that is very easy to enter the jhana, or comparatively easy to enter the jhana. So many things, but I think the biggest thing that the practice of no, that's not true. But one of the very big things that dependent origination gave me was it put this life in context. And until I did dependent origination, I thought the little ups and downs of this life so important. I thought my parenting was responsible for everything. I thought my ambitions in this life were, held some weight. And also I thought my limitations in this life were real somehow. There were certain things that were, not for me because of certain things. But then when I did dependent origination, I saw, this big zoom out. And it was like, no, look. This causal chain of 5 aggregates has been going much more than this life. The cause and effect that is running the show goes way beyond your parenting or your schooling or your North London background. It's vast. And the good karma that you cultivated is way more than you could imagine. The bad karma also. And so it helped put this little life in its proper place. And the little things of, I don't know, who said what, or how well did I do in an exam, or whatever. Really not so important anymore. What does this ex-boyfriend think of me? It really doesn't matter so much in the context of this really big picture. So we start to learn what matters and what doesn't matter. Yeah, it changed a lot. Well, when I could see the dependent origination, actually, the biggest thing was I realized that the teachings of the Buddha are true. And until that time, I was holding in a different way. I was holding it in this way. The practice of meditation is beneficial for me at the moment. I feel the benefit of this practice, so I'm going to keep on doing it. And the truth of the rest of it is up for debate. I don't want to involve too much in the philosophy. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. There's a collection of texts. They sound nice and reassuring. But I had come from kind of a scientific training, and I kind of prided myself on my skepticism. So I wasn't holding that the teachings of the Buddha are true, but when I did dependent origination, I understood, wow, and it was very humbling. and mind-blowing. Wow, this is true. How has no one told me sooner? They had been telling me sooner apart, but I hadn't let it really in. How has no one told me sooner? Why did nobody tell me this at school? It's really true. The Four Noble Truths are really true. It's all suffering. The cycle's fueled by craving. There really is an escape. And the way is the Noble Eightfold Path. It's really, really true. And so that understanding really changed the way that I related to the Dharma, as it being this nice thing I'd found that was helping me feel better. And actually this, I mean, what do you even call it? It's not even a philosophy. It's more than a philosophy. Incredible practice and teachings. It's really true. There's a remainderless ending of all suffering, and there's a way. It's incredible. We are more fortunate than there are words for. This endless cycle of many, many, not just lives, from one big bang to the next, hundreds of thousands of lives. Born, die, born, die, born, suffer, die, born, suffer, die, born, suffer, die. And we've stumbled across the way out. It's amazing. And so this is the main thing I took when I did the dependent origination.